Lesson 9. Meanwhile, in the North. Have you ever had to deal with some kind of limitation? Maybe your fingers are not long enough to reach a chord on the guitar, or you can't quite make the jump from that slam dunk, or you have a medical challenge, or perhaps you process things differently than others around you. No matter what it is, our limits can be incredibly frustrating. Sometimes they affect us only for a season, but at other times they are challenges we have to walk through our entire lives. While our limitations can certainly impact us, they do not have to define us. Throughout history, we see example after example of those who have done incredible things despite the perceived drawbacks they faced. One such example is the scientist we are learning about today, George Mercer Dawson. Meet George Dawson. It is important to note that up to this point, the field of paleontology had largely come out of the U.S. and Europe. But America's sister country to the north carried a shocking reservoir of fossils that were about to be discovered. And this is precisely where today's scientist was born and raised. George Mercer Dawson was born in 1849 in Nova Scotia, Canada. His father was interested in science, studying geology and paleobotany, and eventually became the superintendent of education in Nova Scotia. When Dawson was still young, his family moved to Montreal, and he developed tuberculosis, a fairly common disease at the time that usually affected the lungs. However, Dawson had a rare form of tuberculosis. That was not in his lungs, but instead presented in his spine. It was called Pott's disease. It caused his spinal column to shrink and twist, and this greatly impacted his childhood. Instead of running around kicking a ball and playing with his friends, Dawson spent the majority of his childhood in bed, with special braces and harnesses that kept his body as straight as possible. The fact that Dawson survived this disease is only the beginning of his incredible story. Before the discovery of antibiotics, there was no cure for his condition, one that would have been painful and debilitating. His bedridden childhood caused his father to hire tutors to teach him at home, kind of like being homeschooled. As he approached adulthood, he was only about 4 feet 8 inches tall, while most men probably stood closer to 6 feet tall. He had a twisted spine that made getting around quite tedious. Nevertheless, Dawson was intent on pursuing his interest in science, and he left home when he was just 20 years old to go to London to attend the Royal School of Mines. In order to help him travel the campus grounds to and from his classes and dormitory, his father had a special chair made for him to be carried in. Humiliating? We don't know for sure how Dawson felt about his circumstances, but we do know that he threw himself into his studies instead of feeling sorry for himself. He graduated first in his class just 3 years later. On the road. Upon arriving home, Dawson was offered a position as a surveyor for the Geological Survey of Canada, which he accepted. This position required a lot of travel, both walking and horseback, and yet our inspiring Canadian chose to stretch his limits and not let them hold him back. As part of the GSC, Dawson and his team were responsible for mapping out land, resources, features, and boundaries. Their work was incredibly important and paved the way for a greater understanding to be passed on to universities, the government, libraries, and more. Dawson was known as a leader in anthropology, as well as a highly respected geologist. From the highly contested border between Canada and the United States along the south end of Manitoba to the largely unexplored Yukon Territory, he traveled thousands of miles, making maps, meeting new people, and documenting his findings. Dawson was particularly interested in the customs and traditions of the Haida people from Western Canada. It was in these travels that he came across something surprising. Did you know George Mercer Dawson was known as a cheerful, amiable person? He was well liked by nearly everyone he met, and his work was exemplary. When in the Yukon, he predicted that gold would be found nearly 10 years before the gold rush. Because of his achievements in the region, Dawson City was named after him. The Lambiosaurus. Along the Cypress Hills in Alberta, the GSC came across some dinosaur bones in 1874. While Dawson was certainly a scientist with a wide range of skill and knowledge, paleontology was not his forte. He ended up sending the fossils to Edward Cope for further examination. The bones were found to be the vertebrae of a Hadrosaurus, a type of dinosaur known for its duck-like beak. These were the first dinosaur fossils that had been recorded and studied from Canada, and the very first documented discovery. The stage had been set, and throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, many more fossils were discovered in Canada. In fact, over 400 dinosaur skeletons have been found in what is now known as Canada's Badlands, in this very same region in Alberta. Dawson had just discovered Canada's first dinosaur bones. He had stumbled upon a dinosaur graveyard. It didn't take long for the world to hear about the rich dig in Alberta. Paleontologists from all over converged here, hoping to etch their name in the history books. It was here that the first complete Hadrosaurus was found and named the Lambiosaurus in honor of the Canadian paleontologist Lawrence Lambie. The Lambiosaurus was large with a crest on top of its head, had a strong, heavy hind legs and smaller front legs, with a huge tail. It was thought to be mostly a quadruped, an animal with 4 feet for walking, that could also lean back on its hind legs like a biped, an animal with 2 feet for walking, helping it reach the tasty tops of the trees. Being an herbivore, it had no front teeth and would instead use its bill to rip off leaves and other vegetation and grind them with its back molars. The purpose of their crest has been highly debated, and there are many theories which include being filled with air and used to help them breathe underwater, filled with glands to store excess salt, or, more commonly used, for show and as a renaissance chamber to help them make loud, distinctive calls. Edmontosaurus, Lawrence Lambie, who also worked for the Geological Survey of Canada, found hundreds of fossils in his travels. He discovered not only the Lambiosaurus, but also other types of Hadrosaurus that he named Edmontosaurus, also found near Drumheller in Alberta's Badlands. This crested dinosaur was even larger than the Lambiosaurus, some as long as 49 feet. They had extremely thick, scaly skin, and much similar to their relative, the Lambiosaurus, such as large hind legs and small front legs, a long, thick tail, and the ability to walk either 2 legs or 4. However, unlike the Lambiosaurus, they had a unique beak rather than a flat bill, and a solid crest rather than a hollow one. In 1990, an Edmontosaurus was discovered in Montana that was nicknamed Eddie. Eddie was one of the first juveniles found and belongs to the Institute for Creation Research in Texas, where he was used to help plot the growth patterns of these amazing creatures. Some quick facts. Name meaning Lambie's lizard. He was found in Alberta, Canada. His diet was herbivorous, and his size was 30 feet long. While George Dawson's discovery put Canada on the map, he was better known for his contributions to cartography, anthropology, and geology than anything else. Geology, that's what it is. He found no other dinosaur bones that we know of in his travels, but he lived during an exciting time of discovery and adventure. Dawson overcame adversity and chose not to let it hold him back. He even received an award from Queen Victoria herself. An avid writer, Dawson loved to write poetry. journal about his experiences, and paint or sketch in his notebook. In a memoir about his life, we can see a small glimpse into the person behind the achievements. The times were rife with great men making great strides, but in truth I felt like one of these frogs in my adolescent poems, most certainly the younger, lifted from his own comfortable pond into one so much larger, where the bullfrogs reigned, massive and sure of their place on the largest pad. I knew mental fear, but swore too that when I came back again to Montreal, I would be taller in mind, as tall as any other man of science. George Mercer Dawson, 1869, quoted this. And this is one height that Dawson achieved. Apologetics Corner. We have learned and studied some of the archaeological evidence that showed the Bible is true, as well as the prophetic evidence that shows it can be trusted. This week, we are going to take a look at the historical evidence. The sources below are outside of Scripture, historians and authors who confirm one way or another the characters outlined in the Bible. This gives us further evidence of the truth of Scripture. Choose one or all of the following pieces of historical evidence to research more about. And I'll read each one, and then your teacher can decide what you do with this. Number 1. About 37 years after Jesus died, a Jewish historian named Josephus was born. He wrote books about the history of the Jews. Some of his writings in this book, Antiquities of the Jews, confirm some of the facts in the New Testament as an outside source. His historical documents are not scripture, but they do give us outside evidence of the story of Jesus. At this time, there was a wise man named Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Number 2, Aulelius Cornelius Celsus was a historian who was alive during Jesus' time. He was determined to disprove Jesus and his works, and even wrote a book called The True Word. While we know that Jesus' power was because he was God, 3 in 1, with all authority under heaven, this quote does prove that Jesus both existed and performed many miracles that could not be explained. This is the quote. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain powers which Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. He returned home highly elated at processing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. That was a quote from Aulelius Cornelius Celsus. Number 3, Cornelius Tactus was a historian who wrote a book about Roman Empire called Annals. In talking about a fire in Rome, he talked about Nero's response, but in doing so, he confirms the story of Jesus and the history of the persecuted church outlined in the book of Acts. This is a quote here. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius on the hands of one of our own perpetrators, Pontius Pilate. So he was talking about Jesus. Number 4, a historian named Julius Africanus wrote about the darkness that covered the land on the day that Jesus was crucified. He was quoting a man named Thalius, who had been alive at the time of Jesus. And this is the quote. On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judah and other districts were thrown down. And that concludes Lesson 9 for today.